Hello and welcome to another video here at TD Channel. Today we're gonna continue our series of lectures on Introduction to Programming, and today we're gonna concentrate on functions. Functions are extremely useful, and it's something that you are gonna need to use on a day-to-day basis to be able to write programs that are maintainable and that just run as efficiently as possible. So let's take a look at what functions are. What are functions? Functions are constructs that allow you to prepackage code that can be executed through a symbol. They are very useful to avoid having repetitive code, and they can increase code maintainability. So let's expand on this a little bit. Basically, what this allows you to do is it allows you to take a whole bunch of lines of code. Let's say that you write a simple algorithm to handle something that you need to do, and let's say that this is 50 lines of code. And let's say that you're going to need to use this in several places in your program. Instead of having to rewrite that or copy and paste it all over the place, you can create a function for it and assign a very simple symbol to it, a name, an alias, let's call it. And then whenever you need to invoke those 50 lines of code, all you have to do is call that symbol and you'll execute all the code that's inside that function. So how are functions created? Well, that depends on the language, but here's a very common function definition. You'll usually have a return type, and then you'll have the function keyword, which it changes from language to language. Then on some languages you're going to have a namespace, like for example in C++ you'll have a namespace. Not all the times, but when you're inside of a class, for example. Then you'll have the function name, then your argument, and then the body of the function. Let's say you want to create a function that does a power of 2 on any number that you give it. Let's see how you would create this in different languages. For example, in C++, what you would do is you would type float, because the function is going to return a float value. Then you're going to type the keyword function to let the language know that you're trying to write a function. Then you give it the function name, which in this case we're going to call it power 2. And then you give it the arguments for this function. In this case, the arguments are a single float, and we're giving it this keyword constant in front of the float a, because basically what this lets the program know is that you're not going to be changing the value of a at all. You're going to be returning a new value, but the value of a should not be changed at all. And then inside the body of the function, what you're going to do is just return a times a, which is pretty much a power. So because the a was a float, when you multiply those two together you get a float, and then you get, as you can see here at the beginning, the float value, the return value is going to be a float. Let's look at this same function in mail. In mail you would usually use the keyword global, which lets mail know that this procedure is going to be available on every scope of your program. Then instead of function you would use the keyword proc. Mail calls them procedures instead of functions. Then you give it the return type, which is float, and then the function name, power 2, and then float a. Now you see we have a dollar in front of a. That's because in mail all variables are accessed with a dollar in front of the variable name. That's what lets you know that you're dealing with a variable. And then inside we do the same thing. We just do a return a times a. And then finally let's look at it in Python. Python, because it's a typeless language where basically you don't have to specify the type of the variable that you're dealing with, then you don't really have to specify the type that you're going to output. So as you can see, the Python function is a lot simpler. All you do is def, which is the keyword for defining a procedure, and then you give it the name, power 2, and then you give it the incoming variable a. Now you see on the other ones we would have to say float a or float a here or up here. In Python, because it's not typed, all you have to do is give it a. Then you have a colon, then you indent, because as you know, Python white space and indentations are very important, and then you do a return a times a. So this is something that a lot of people ask when they're first getting used to programming. They ask, when should I use functions? And my answer tends to be if you need to use the same code in more than one location, then you should turn that into a function. Basically, what this will allow you to do is it will allow you to maintain your code a lot better. Let's say that you have, once again, back to the same example we were before, a function that has 50 lines of code, and you're using this on 100 different places all over your code. If you need to modify the original function because you found a bug or something, then you only have to edit one single place, which is where you define the function. If you didn't use functions, you would have to go everywhere that you use that and replace and fix that bug, which, as you can think, it would be a complete nightmare. Another place where you should use functions is if you're using the same code but with very little differences from one call to another, then you would probably turn that into a function and give and create parameters to change the things that are a little bit different. And you guys are going to see examples of this as we move on forward and in different scripts and different videos in our website. Another reason why you would use functions is if this piece of code is something that could be very useful in other scripts. It's not uncommon for people to create what's known as libraries, which basically it's a file that doesn't do anything by itself, but it just contains a whole bunch of functions that you could use whenever you need. This will allow you to write code a lot faster because as you are writing and as you're figuring stuff out, you're just going to keep expanding your library. And then finally, like I just said, if you're developing a library or a module, you would probably use functions all over the place for that. So let's try to write some functions in Python and in Mel so you guys can see a little bit of how things work. Let's look for my location. So let's start with Mel, which is a little bit it's a little bit more complicated than Python, but we'll dive right into it. As I said a little bit earlier, you're going to start with the word global, and then you're going to give the word proc, which is the keyword that lets you know this is a procedure. Now we're going to return an integer here, and that's why we have this word. And then the name of our function is going to be get number of lights, right? So this very simple function, what's going to do is going to look through the scene and return the number of lights that it found. You can see here that this function takes no parameters. So when you call it, all you have to do is call it like right down here. But let's look at the body of the function. It's very simple. It's only 2 lines. So the first thing you're going to do is create an array of strings called lights, and that's why you have this dollar here because this is a variable. And then we have the 2 square brackets here at the end because this is an array. And then we're going to do a list, ls, of minus lights. So this is a Mel command that basically just lists whatever object you tell it. And if you say, for example, list minus lights, it's only going to list lights. If you say list minus geometry, it's only going to list geometry. So we're going to get the lights, and then at the end, on the next line, what we're going to do is return size of lights. And size is a function. It's a built-in function into Mel that returns the size of an array. And since the previous one was an array, this is going to tell you how many objects are inside that array. So in our scene, we have 2 lights right here. And if I run this, let's go ahead and first run this to evaluate it. And then if we run this at the bottom, you see it's going to return 2. So what happens if we want to make very small changes to this function? I just want to introduce a couple of other concepts. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to duplicate these lights. So keep duplicating. Let's create a bunch of lights. Let's move this here. I'm not using a mouse. I'm using the little touchpad, and it's a little bit harder to do. Okay, so now we have several lights, and if I run this again, it's going to tell you we have 5 lights. Well, what if we wanted to, for some reason, restrict the return value so it has a maximum? So we can go over here and say get number of light and then do integer max, which would basically let you know that what's the maximum number of lights that you can return. So we're gonna try to limit the number of lights that is returned. So we're gonna put here int $max, which is going to be the maximum number that we can return. So down here, what we can do is a very simple if statement. If size of lights is greater than max, then we're gonna return max. Else, and then down here we're gonna just return the size. So now if we call this function, and let's go ahead and try to evaluate it. Let's say here we give it a value of 10, and we go ahead and run this. Let's see, the procedure is missing a return statement. So, oh, I missed this here. Okay, so we try this again, and it's going to tell us 5. We only have 5 lights, and we told it that the maximum was going to be 10. But what if I go ahead and change this? I want the maximum to be 4. So this should return only 4. Once again, we added a parameter to our function that will allow us to change how the function behaves internally. This is what I was talking about when I said that if you have a bunch of code that you want to reuse, but you only need very little things to change inside the code, that's when you would use function parameters to change the behavior. So this is a very simple example of how things work in Mail. Now let's give it a look at how they work in Python. And actually, let's go ahead and let's go to, and try to translate this over to Python. So we're gonna take, we're gonna create a new pad here, a new tab. Let me go ahead and do this. We're gonna make it a Python. So what was the name of it? It was called get number of lights. So we're gonna do first we're gonna import the Maya command. So we're importing the Maya Python module into this tab, and then we're going to do something as simple as define get number of lights, and then we're going to do return length of cmds.ls. So here you can see how Python is somewhat more efficient in the amount of lines that it takes. Basically what I'm doing here is I'm defining my function. I'm giving it no parameters at the moment. I'll add that a little bit later. And then what I'm doing is I'm going to return len here. This function len is basically the equivalent as size, which will give us the size of an array. And then here cmds.ls. This ls is the same command as the one as over here, ls, but you have to access it through the Python module, which is called cmds. So you do cmds.ls and then lights equals true. This is just Python syntax, and as you get used to it, you'll see that things are a little bit different, but still pretty easy to remember and go from Mail back to Python inside of Maya. Now we're going to go ahead and run this, get number of lights. And then if we run this, forgot to probably print this. And we're going to do this. And there we go, we have 5. Once again, now we want to add a parameter to it. And here, Python will allow us to do something that Mail doesn't allow you to, which is to give a default value to a parameter. So let's say I want to do max. And by default, I want max to be 10. Well, what this does is it tells your script that a user can provide a parameter called max, but if they don't provide it, then use 10 as default. While in Mail, you don't have a default right here, which means every time you call it, you're going to have to call it and provide a maximum value. So this makes it a little bit nicer and cleaner because people can still call it this way. So let's go ahead and modify this. We're going to do, take this back. So we're going to do if, we're going to capture this first. No need to run the same command twice. So we're going to do this and do lights equals this. If length of lights is greater than max, then we're gonna return max. Else, I keep indenting wrong here, return length of lights. Right, so now we should be able to run this right here. And now if I run it, it gives me 5. And if I give it here a value of 2, it's going to give me 2. So there you have it. Very simple introduction into how functions can work. And just so you guys can see a little bit a more complex example of this, let's go ahead and show you a more involved function somewhere over here. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and open this file. Let's navigate to my location. Let's go into videos. And then here we're going to look at a file called, where is it? We're going to go into TDC-JSON. And in here we have a Maya camera module. So I'm just going to look at this. And then here we have a function that has 74 lines. And like I said, there's a whole bunch of code in here, right? You can see it's 79 lines of code. And there's a whole bunch of if statements doing a whole bunch of different checks. And this function takes a couple of parameters. It takes a camera and a file name. But if we go back into Maya and see how it was used, you can see this is all we have to call. So there you can see how powerful functions are. By just calling this one little line behind the scenes, what we're actually calling is this 79 lines of code that do, it's not complicated, but it does a lot more work than what this one line did. So that's all for functions for now. Hope you guys were able to grasp this concept, because we're going to look into them a lot through all of our videos. Thank you very much, and talk to you guys soon.